I have a question for the guys in this group that obviously have played ankle sprains. You guys have had them, low, high, whatever it may be. There are two very distinct schools of thought on them that I've seen teammates and myself try both. I'm curious what you guys have tried. Obviously, you have the rest, ice, elevate, all that stuff, put it in a boot, right. Don't move it. And then I've seen other people that 100% believe in wrapping it up, moving it, like wrapping it up in one of those stretchy bands, moving it around, flossing it, getting it in heat, trying to get stuff flowing through there. Which ones have you guys done? And which do you like?
I've done it, but I mean, I've done it a million times. I mean, once it goes down from being a giant club foot, then I think you got to move that thing around. It always felt better once you got out there and you actually played or you practiced on it. Like it felt like you loosened it up a little bit. So you got to hope it doesn't swell back up though once you do that.
Yeah, once you loosen it up and it starts feeling good, then it hurts more the next day. Now you're on a carousel with this ankle for the time. Have you ever, for a corner, that's a tough spot.
A lot, but I'm a big range of motion guy. It's fast, it's quickly. I got a band pumping. I'm like you said, if it is super swollen, you got to drain it maybe or get some of that fluid out of there. But I'm a big range of motion guy. I hate keeping it in the boot, keeping it wrapped up tight. I hate all that shit. But
you said rice?
Rice, yeah. What is it? Rest, ice.
Yeah, rest, ice,
compression, elevation.
Elevate.
Yeah.
Oh, that's how you heal?
Yeah, that's how you.
I thought you put it in rice like a foam.
Yeah, I thought you was trying to dry it out, trying to dehydrate your ankle.
Good.
Acronym.
Rest, ice, compression, elevate.
Elevate, yep.
How about you, AQ?
I think there's a combination of both. I think you have to start off with, all the ice and try and get as much swelling out as you can. All the, what's it called? Hivamat, all that stuff. Just kind of flush everything, push everything. But then as the week goes, then we get on the field, we wrap it up, put all the, whatever you want to call it, the floss stuff on there to kind of give all the stuff and get out on the field and get it moving.
Yeah, put all the stuff. Give all the stuff
on there. I forget all the names now. I'm done playing. I don't have to wrap anything up.
AJ, you remember John Simon?
Of course.
Yeah, he's the one he was the first one that I saw who he sprained his ankle very, very badly. And 30 seconds later, he had that floss and he just wrapped it around. He was moving it and he was in the training room and I was like, "What are you doing, man?" Like the trainers are coming over with an ice pack and he was like, "Get that shit away from me." He goes, "I got this." And he just wrapped it and was moving around, walking, like doing as much movement as humanly possible. And he literally was at practice the next day. And from that moment forward, I was like, "Wow, I'm never icing my ankle again." Man.
So that sounds like that's who you are. You're Simon. You went with that.
I switched completely. Like this isn't medical advice for anybody. This is just what I did. I used to be the ice guy, like the stem, like all that type of stuff. I do believe in Hivamat. AQ is absolutely right on that. Hivamat gets all that swelling out. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But I am now a wrap it up, move it, get that thing. I don't want it to stiffen up. I don't want it to be in a boot. I don't want it to be iced because as soon as it locks up, it's so difficult to unlock. Again, not medical advice, just what I did.
Sounds like.
Find some sand to walk on. If you can walk on some sand, man, that's the best rehab you can do for your ankle.
Because you have to strengthen your ankle while you're walking on sand because the instability, right? And that kind of
Oh yeah. All the little stabilizers and stuff when you think about all those uneven steps and push in. Yeah, I think walking on sand is the best.
That's why water too.
Yeah.
Like water, like the pools and
water's
like
great.
Running, get the flexibility, all that.
Those treadmills at the bottom of pools, that's a good advancement in technology.
Those are sweet. Sick.
You felt really cool when you were using those. And then the side shot. Look at your gait here. You see, you're kind of, and then
you start to question yourself pretty heavily when you watch yourself walk. Man, you're like, geez, I walk weird. You ever do that?
Is that how I always look walking? Just so I know. Yeah, you're back to normal. Really? Yikes. That's what I look like normally? Yeah. All right. We need to. I'm happy to hear the knee's good, but we need to change some other things in my life. Let's go